So, Mr. Jim Smith, welcome to Ordinary Visionaries.
It's my pleasure to be here, Robert.
So, Jim has you were a client for a long time. You were in my mastery program. You were really instrumental in helping me with mastery program follow-up programs in which we did the open space and
Yeah.
all of that stuff these many years ago. And I'm really excited to interview you because you do something and have an approach very different than almost anyone else I've worked with. And so I want to know, how are you an ordinary visionary?
Well, like I said, I struggled with the question a little bit. And just before calling in for this interview, I had a chemistry call with a new coaching client.
Chemistry
And
call being an initial call to see if you connect.
right,
Okay.
right. Most people will interview two or three coaches and see which one resonates the most with them. Discovery call, chemistry call, enrollment call. It has all kinds of names.
Yep.
And of course, just a little plug to you for your past work. I mean, I remember the days when I would be interviewed by 10 people and get selected by one. And these days, if I get interviewed by, 10 people, I'll be selected by three or four. I have, a 30 to 40% hit rate. Um, so this client or this prospective client whom I'd love to work with is a little bit different in that she is not in an executive role yet. She's been tapped by her organization as having high potential, and she's a senior contributor at this point. About to make this move into a leadership role, and so she was asking me some of the same questions, like what makes you different, and why would you be a good coach for me, and what's your belief system? So what what I believe makes me an ordinary visionary, the way you're defining it, is that I come into any conversation with a client from a base of believing, knowing that leadership is a completely independent skill set of anything that you know.
Hmm.
Um, a little bit of my background that I think you know of is that when I was in the corporate space, I went from operations to field sales manager to CFO of a small division of a company to HR. I mean, I was like all over the place. And in several of those jobs, I didn't have the technical expertise. And so very early on in my career, I was taught to separate leading people from being the smartest person in the room technically. Two
Hmm.
different skill sets. And in my freelance practice over decades, I have grown a global business. I'm now up to 40 countries where I have coached leaders.
No
And
kidding.
yeah, 40. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah.
Amazing.
And, you know, the the culture shifts, the kind of work they do is very different, but across the board, the struggle of letting go and of letting go of knowing, of letting go of being smart, of letting go of doing the work to leading people, at that next level, um, it's universal. It's a universal struggle, and executive presence is a universal concept. Like everybody shows up. That's what they're looking for. And the back to the ordinary visionary piece, I've learned I'm really good at helping people understand what it is in their bones, like how to walk, talk, sit, stand, breathe, do presentations from a place of presence. So when you walk into a room, you change it in a positive way. Your brand is about leading, not about being the best engineer or scientist or doctor or corporate executive. It's
So
not.
it's
It's
about
not
bringing
about
people
this.
together. It's about getting people aligned. It's getting things to happen in a way that works for everybody, all that kind of stuff, right?
Well, that's the downflow. When a leader learns to stop solving problems and instead holding the space for problems to be solved, and that's a critical distinction that I've created on my own. It's one I offer to my clients all the time. You change the way you impact the world. So I'm not working with their teams. I do team coaching. I do group coaching. When I'm working with a person in an executive role, though, what I'm really focusing on is changing them. They are the instrument of leadership.
Right.
And if they change, then what's going to happen is everybody who's in their downflow is going to feel that impact.
Right.
They're going to sense the difference. And that's where I make my change in the world.
So, Chris, where did Chris come from? It was the guy I interviewed yesterday, Jim. You have an interesting business name. I always remember that from the very first day I met you, the Executive Happiness Coach.
Right.
Which is an interesting branding decision because it doesn't sound like everybody else. So it sort of brings up some curiosity. And you're very steeped in the whole discipline of positive psychology. So how does that whole, what is your whole genre or milieu of thought around leadership, given that it has to do with happiness and fulfillment and, stuff often people aren't thinking about with leadership. It's not the first thing they think about. But obviously you think it's really important and it makes a difference.
Yeah. Indeed, I've actually encountered people, none of whom I continued to work with. I've actually encountered people who, like back away from me like I'm some kind of crazy person when they get the title. I've worked with organizations where I show up to do a workshop or something, and they've taken the copy I sent them in advance and whited out my logo. And they'll say things like, well, if our president saw your title, he wouldn't stay in the session. Good Lord, you need me more than ever.
But you whited it out. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. We can't talk about happiness here. The thing is, that's not my core work. I do talk about happiness and positive psychology and the whole family of emotions, joy, enthusiasm, zest, expectation, ambition, all these positive emotions that help us enjoy life and feel productive.
Yeah.
The happiness in my title, though, is not about, I only bring happiness, you need to be positive. It's about helping people know in advance, if they're going to work with me, that we are going to be in the emotional space. I believe, and I bring this every time, every emotion has value. Every emotion that we experience as human beings evolved to deal with a care we have. Like the whole anger family is about defending when some harm has been done to something we care about. Sadness is being in touch with our care. Happiness is being in touch in a way that we're enjoying something we care about.
Right.
And then the whole fear family is being vigilant to prevent harm to something we care about or someone we care about. So much of my work is not necessarily about driving happiness or satisfaction. It's more helping people notice every day, what's your relationship with emotions? Because you're human, you're having them, whether you acknowledge it or not.
Yes.
How do you deal with those? And how do you influence the emotions of the people around you? Are you a toxic cesspool of, anger and bitterness all the time? That's going to affect your culture. And And if you are, how do we shift that? Or are there emotions you can't access? Like, I do a lot of work with women executives who have been socialized they can't be angry. Well, if you can't be angry, how do you access dignity, which is like confidence with righteous anger? It's like, I deserve this. If you can't access anger, how do you deal with people who aren't delivering on their accountabilities and doing it repeatedly? Like, you need some of that
Sure.
to be productive. So
Sure.
it's dancing in all the emotions and learning how to recognize in yourself whether you're wearing a diminished emotion or an expansive emotion, how to put those on, how to bring them on stage, how to upskill your brand in the organization. And that's the language of marketing, you might notice, right? So it's also about brand management. Like, what do you represent? What do you do every day?
It's interesting when people talk about other people, they talk in emotional language.
Uh-huh.
Is he a nice person? Is he a caring person?
Yeah.
Is he a hard ass? Is he a mean person? Is he an ignoramus or whatever? Because we're always filtering through that particular thing. So knowledge is important, expertise is important, but you can have someone with a ridiculous amount of expertise who is a complete asshole. Apparently, what's his name? Steve Jobs was a bit like that. I mean, an absolute genius. We owe a lot to Steve Jobs, but he was not an easy guy to work with.
No. Yeah. Reputation tells us that. Well, and of course, he was so much of a jerk that he got fired from his own company. And we all know the story of how he eventually got hired back. And when he got hired back, he was still a critical, incredibly demanding, creative spirit, but he'd learned how to manage that and surround himself with people who could buffer that so that, the creative genius came through without all the toxicity. Another great example these days is, we've got two right now. Elon Musk and one of our presidential candidates, like toxic cesspools of negativity. People who are just constantly making decisions that seem cruel or ungrounded. And my job is not to judge. It is to notice, though. I mean, getting headlines and media attention is very different from leading. If I set my hair on fire every day, I could have a lot of cameras on my property, but that's not really going to serve any of the people that I work with,
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to get into more depth of how you actually work with clients. And, every client is different, of course, but we all have our processes and our approaches and first things that we do. And I'd like to know a bit about that. How do you take people through? So you have someone who's an executive in most cases, right? And they want to be a better executive. They want to be more successful. They want to lead better. They want to enjoy their job better. They want to get corporate, all the things that an executive would want. So, with a clean slate, you start working with a client. What do you take them through? And tell us why you do the things you do and where that goes and what kind of results happen out of that.
Well, executive coaching in general, is a profession that very much is about starting where they are. So I can't say I have a canned approach. Once we're beyond the concept of just kind of setting a stage and defining goals, their goals and where they are relative to them really define what's next. Having said that, though, because a lot of my brand is proclaiming that executive presence, helping you develop executive presence. That's one of my superpowers.
Right.
Okay. There's other things I don't do well. Like I'm not going to be a good business coach because that's coaching your entity.
Right.
For example. So because people are coming to me to work on their executive presence, we very quickly get into the conversation of self-awareness. Where are you? How conscious are you of yourself? Because that's what people are seeing. This is a metaphor I introduced to most of my clients very early on.
Yep.
The metaphor is that moving into leadership role is like climbing a mountain. This uses the pyramid concept of organizations very well. The higher you go, the more responsibility you take on, the higher you go on the mountain. And of course, the higher you are, the better the view. You've climbed that. You've earned it. You've done the work to get there. And so when you turn around and look down, like you own all that, right? That's your downflow. And that can feel really awesome. And there's also a tremendous responsibility with it because once you own that downflow, that means everybody who's behind you is going to get hit with whatever you put out, right? Yeah. Toxicity, neutrality,
good, bad, or ugly.
Positivity. Yeah.
Right.
So where are you in that? How aware are you of your downflow and the impact you have? Do you know what impact you have? Have you, even in organizations that do 360 assessments, they're very often, anonymous scaling things that psychologists have put a lot of time and energy into, and that cost hundreds of dollars. But when people get their 360, they ignore 99% of it. What they do is they page to the back to read the narrative comments. What they really want is qualitative feedback. Am I a jerk or am I a nice person? How do people perceive me?
Right.
So I start there.
None of this respect me or not respect me. Yeah.
Yeah. So could I do a little exercise with you?
Sure.
This is something that might come up very early in a conversation as we're having this self-awareness exercise. Sometimes people say, well, what do you mean by self-awareness? So, could we do a little exercise? I'll ask, like I just did you. All right. So I invite you to just pay attention to your breath. Okay? Just watch it. And when you are breathing in and out, where does the breath go when you go in, when you breathe in?
To my solar plexus, my stomach.
Okay. All right. Now, I can tell you just from that, I already have a gauge on where you are on self-awareness. An astounding number of people in executive roles, when I do that same intro exercise with them, they will say, what do you mean? Or, I don't know. Or they'll look at me like I've grown two heads and they'll say, well, it's going into my lungs. And I'm like, no. You know that.
Yeah. Where
do you feel it?
Right.
And usually by that time, I'll have been observing them for a while. So I'm watching them breathe into their throat. Like their anxiety is so high. Or so if you don't know where your breath is, if you can't track it and shift it on purpose, you do not have emotional self-mastery. You can't control your emotions unless you are aware of and can manage your breath, because every single emotion has a breath and a body that goes with it.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
In a teaching that I studied years ago, said the seat of emotions is your solar plexus, which is right here. So if you're coming from your solar plexus, you're more grounded, you're more present. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there is that somatic element of all this work. If the quick exercise we often do, that I often do in talks and workshops and so on, is I want you to take your hand and place your thumb on your navel, and then lay your hand right. Adjust this here. Then lay your hand down below your navel, right there. Okay.
Yeah.
So about 2 to 3 inches behind that hand is your center. Up, down, front, back, side to side. That is your physical center.
Right.
And incidentally, it is also the place of calm, the place of centeredness. It's if you can find that space, you can find ground.
I know what you mean. It's definitely not in the head, which is spinning with thoughts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Often I call it I am here, and it's just you feel like, and the breath is an important sort of component about that.
Right. Yeah. So, again, I've worked with executives who the first time I ask them that, they do the I don't know, and I'm like, well, okay, so here's why you need to know. This is an element that will be very important to you. And of course, we're gonna continue our conversations about wherever they're coming from, and I will generally introduce them to some exercises, or sometimes they create them themselves, that will help them practice being aware. I remember one guy that I work with. He found that he was really bothered by that first exercise we did. He was just like panicked. Oh my gosh, I should be able to track this. So he would lie awake at night. That 10, 15 minutes when you lay in bed before you fall asleep, many of us.
Yeah.
He discovered all on his own that if he put his hands on his abdomen and just worked on making it go up and down, that he was training his body. He was more aware of his breath. Somehow standing up and in meetings, he wasn't aware. But when he was laying down, he could feel the flow. I worked with him several years ago, and I just had lunch with him about 4 months ago.
Yeah.
And during our lunch, he even shared with me, he said, I still do that breathing thing at night. Like, great. And his brand as a leader has shifted tremendously over the years, because he always starts with kind of getting himself in the right space before he goes on stage, before he goes out to have a conversation with someone.
So, in a way, what you're saying is presence is very, it's very physical. It's very tangible. It's not a concept. It's a being here. In awareness and in your body, just here. So someone that has executive presence you feel grounded by that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like when they're there, you feel, you don't feel all scattered and confused and, upset or anything like that. It's like, okay, which is kind of nice if you have a leader that he's there. It flashes back to old movies I've seen and leadership in movies, and a leader who was just there,
Right. And that is a quality that people often cite around the best leaders. There's an exercise in the space of emotional intelligence. Richard Boyatzis, who's one of the founders, the inventors, not the inventors, but the discoverers of emotional intelligence back in the 80s, where he asks everyone in the audience to think about the worst boss they ever had.
The worst thought they've ever had.
Worst boss they've ever had.
Okay.
Worst boss they've ever had, and then the best boss they've ever had. And the exercise is to list some of the qualities, what made them a best boss, what made them a worst boss. I've done this exercise myself. I've seen it done many times, been in the audience for it. What comes up out of the group is the same thing every time. The bad boss didn't behave in a way that people felt respected. They didn't listen. They weren't there. They were always focused on task and getting to the next thing. And the good bosses were, a very common quality is when I had conversations with them, that's all they focused on. They just focused on me. They were like there in that conversation with me. I felt heard. I felt respected. And some of that is absolutely intellectual. I mean, you got to be smart to connect with people, to understand the skills. If you don't embody it, though, it doesn't matter what you say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to put you off track, but thoughts pop up, I was meeting with someone the other day, and something that was clear for me is he had a listening issue,
Okay.
a bit of a listening issue. And every time I said something, he had to, you never felt that he heard your answer, but he always had his comment kind of thing. And that just, when you have a great boss, you feel that he's here and listening, and he cares, and he's interested. Not that he doesn't have great things to say as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting to me that in all of the educational institutions across the globe, over centuries, we've gotten very, very good at putting knowledge in people's heads. And there are very few high school or college curriculums anywhere in the world that don't include a class in communications and presentation skills.
Very few.
There isn't a school that doesn't have something about that.
Okay.
But no one has a class in listening.
That seems insane, doesn't it, really, when you come to it? All the problems in marriage, relationships, everywhere, it's so much about listening.
Yeah. And every culture has some version of the cliche that you have two ears and one mouth and you should use them in that order.
Yeah.
That's not how we operate. So, learning how to listen and simply hold the space for someone else is a skill that people have to be conscious of developing.
I was in a course once where they said, we're going to give you a koan for the course. And the course is, no one listens, no one ever has, and no one ever will. It's that bad. Listening.
Kind of depressing.
But it's true. Like, if you're in a group of people that are chatting, everyone wants to be heard. And people talk over each other.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this thing happened, and you never feel that anyone is really embracing someone else's experience. Not never, but it's kind of rare. Which is one reason why I hate big parties, because it's like, I don't know, it's just the connection really isn't happening.
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Okay. So if I could riff on that for a minute, you talk about leaders listening, you talk about parties. Okay, so if you've ever had a class in networking, and anyone listening to this, has probably had some training, a talk, a webinar on how to network. At the heart of great networking is to be interested, not interesting. Yes. Most of us want to be interesting. We want to tell people how fabulous we are, what we think.
Yes.
And yet the people we remember, the conversations we think are the best, are the ones where we walk away and we realize, oh my gosh, I know nothing about that person.
But I like them.
Because they asked me questions. They listened to me.
It's so simple. but it's like rocket science for most people. It's, it's even rocket science for me who teaches this and understands this because, so it's our ego wants to be recognized. I want to be recognized. I want people to like me. So then to do that, I believe I have to be out there and be impressive. And it's taken me a long, long time to learn this.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really important. People say, well, I don't like networking. I don't like talking about myself. And I say, oh, that's perfect. Don't talk about yourself. Find out about them. And it's like, well, how can I market myself if I'm doing that? And well, the more you learn out about them, the more connections you'll find and potentials for something. But people have to really actively practice that, like the exercise you gave about the guy with the breathing exercise. Like, go to a party and only listen and answer questions. Never say anything about yourself unless someone asks you.
Well,
and then keep it brief.
Right. And then more importantly, be curious about the other people.
Yeah.
Now, let me tie this back to the idea of executive presence.
Yeah.
Because, this is the ordinary visionary part. While most people have never had a class in listening, they've probably seen it done. I encounter a lot of people who I want to be a better listener, but I'm trying. And so another exercise that comes up commonly, I say, well, so could we do a little experiment here? I invite you to put on your listening body, put on your best listening body. I ask you to do that right now, Robert. Put on your best listening body.
Okay. You're on.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now, what I often see is that people will scoot up to the front of their chair and lean forward. Okay, I'm listening now, right?
Uh-huh.
And I say, okay, so I want you to stay there for a second. I'm going to do the same thing, and I'll do this, right? And they're like, okay, so what are you feeling right now? Well, I feel like you're pushing into my space. I feel like you're, I said, exactly. That is not a listening body. That is will you please stop talking so I can say what I'm going to say? Because I'm not listening to you, really. I'm waiting for my turn to talk body.
I love that.
What? Yeah. So anytime you make it about, anytime you have a thought that I want to prove to you I'm listening, paraphrasing, nodding my head, leaning in, in that moment, you're not listening. You're trying to demonstrate that you're listening. You want it to be about you being a good listener. And it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy. This is hard as shit. Okay. So one of the, here's another little trick, a leadership hack. Anytime you're in a conversation where you want your principal job to be taking in information and listening and allowing the other person to feel heard, the small of your back, especially the small of your back, but ideally your entire spine, will be in contact with the back of your chair. You try it yourself. Just right now, okay? It's a subtle shift, right? But if you're conscious of being back in back energy, you are now in receiving energy. Depending on which metaphor you're using, we might call this openness. It's a curious body, like a satellite dish. I'm receiving in this body, as opposed to being the antenna in the satellite dish where I'm sending. If you use earth elements, this is water. And when you think about water, how does water behave? Well, if you drop a stone into water, the water just receives it.
Yeah.
That's what listening is. That's what a listening body is. So when the physical exercise is keeping your spine against the chair and your feet on the floor and imagining that you are this bowl of water, this satellite dish. I have I've done like, I don't know, something close to 9,000 hours of coaching over my career.
Well,
And this one little thing, this listening thing, this listening body is one of the things that I get excited about. I still get excited about whenever I find an opportunity to teach someone this distinction. Because very often the way it surfaces is, we've been coaching for a while, and then one day they'll come in and say, okay, so the thing I want to work on today is I've got this difficult employee or this difficult conversation. Difficult. Okay, so, let's talk about what it is, what you're trying to accomplish, what kind of outcome do you want from this conversation? And very often there's built in here somewhere an assessment that this person is not performing, they're not bringing it on, they're not driving anything. And so I'll walk them through, maybe we'll do a role play or something like that. And one of the ahas that often comes up is they have developed a story in their head that is so strong that this person doesn't have value. So what happens is most of the time when that person comes in to have a conversation with them, they're just basically going, blah, go do your stuff, stop getting in my face. And so I invite them to try this out. Almost every time. The next time we talk, they're like, oh my God. Like, when I stopped talking, it turns out they've just been trying to talk. Sometimes the story they have in their head comes from a mistake that person made 2 years ago, but ever since then, they've never really listened to that person because their story is that person's an idiot. I can't wait to fire him. But when you just listen, it turns out people have got a lot more to contribute if you stop assuming in advance that they don't have anything to contribute. And you can only do that from a listening body, receiving. Shut up, in other words.
yeah, especially if you've got someone that's where your rough edges or your sharp edges are conflicting. You'd have different personality types, et cetera, et cetera.
No.
Yeah.
So,
this distinction, or these distinctions that you're making, like the breath. I mean, if people only got this from this conversation, it would be valuable. Being in presence means breathing from your solar plexus, from the center of your body, right? And listening is leaning back and being grounded. What I feel is like this, sort of like this, opening one's arms, as opposed to,
right.
now sometimes you lean forward for stuff, but
Yeah. I mean, sending a signal, transmitting, that's important. You need to know how to communicate clearly. Write clear emails, do a presentation, send a message, have an opinion, offer your insight. Back to that 2 ears and 1 mouth thing, though. How can you have an informed opinion if you don't know how to hear other ideas? If you don't know how to let them in and take them in and process them and mix them up with your own?
So when you're working with clients and you're starting to coach them about these distinctions of presence,
No.
well, what's next? What are some of the other kinds of skills? And when you really get into this deeply, there's so many refined things that we don't really think about all the time. I'd just like to hear more of these things.
Once we're in the conversation, and once people understand some of the basics of self-management, managing your presence, managing your emotions, noticing the stories you're telling yourself, and realizing that most of them are just stories, right? So we can perhaps change the story or consider a different story or interpretation of things. Then it's a matter of expanding their vocabulary.
Can we back up a bit to the whole thing about the story you're telling yourself? This is not an insignificant point.
Okay.
My intro to this was the work of Byron Katie, where you...
Oh, yeah. Well, you and I share that passion. I cite her work all the time.
Right.
Suffering occurs when we argue with reality.
Right.
When we argue with what is.
Yeah. But we have stories we believe.
Right.
Sincerely.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we start to question them, we see that maybe those stories don't hold any water. Like this person is like this. Let's question that. Are they really? Is that really true? Or they should do this. My favorite thing. They should do this. For this is the way things should be. Or all that does is add upset and conflict and whatever. So this whole thing about stories. So, it's very tricky because we have stories and then we say, well, I shouldn't have those stories. No matter what we do, we're always beating ourselves up, whether it's other people or whatever. There's this place of arguing with reality, right? Just whatever is happening isn't the way it should be. And we live our lives like that to a great degree.
Yeah. And
so how do you approach that? Give me an example of how not conceptually, how you'd approach that with someone. You say, oh, I see a sticking point in this person. They're keep saying this, and I see a stuckness there in a story that they have about themselves or other people.
Yeah. Well, generally early in a coaching relationship, I will introduce this idea to people. It's at the core of ontology, which is that everything that happens in the world is neutral. And then we look at it, we tell ourselves a story, we have an emotional reaction that's based on that interpretation, and then we take action accordingly.
Right.
So it's a concept that I can then bring back many times over many sessions, many conversations, simply to say, okay, so let's notice, what is the story you're telling yourself here? And as a result of telling yourself that story, what are you already predisposing? What assumptions are you bringing here?
Right.
Right. So what are some other possible perspectives? It's interesting. I find that people who have done leadership work already, and or people who have worked in like the human resources, talent management space, they often get it already because, like when there's an employee issue and somebody comes in to complain to HR, we need to fire this person or they're unethical or whatever. The standard approach is to say, okay, I hear and I hear your version of this. We are not going to take action until we do a little bit of investigation, because there are also always multiple perspectives on what happened, right? The same event, like my favorite example to use is it's a cloudy day. What's your story? There's clouds in the sky when you walk out. Okay. What's the story you tell? Well, it might be, oh, good, my garden needs rain. Or it might be, oh, shit, here we go again, another gloomy day. And you allow your mood to be dictated by the clouds, which have no correlation, causation maybe, but no correlation. If you live in Southern California, like you rejoice, you do a happy dance. So,
right.
But the clouds in the sky is just neutral. It's just neutral. So once people grasp that concept, that a single event can create way different moods, perceptions, stories, then we have the opportunity every time to say, okay, so what's the story you're telling yourself? What are some other perspectives? How might somebody else be looking at this, do you believe? And if they believe that, how are they probably going to show up in the conversation? How are you going to show up in the conversation? All right. So instead, how do you want to show up in that conversation or that meeting? What emotion would you rather wear? How would you rather behave? And so we can build that and try it on. And then they go out into the wild, into their job, and they do it differently. And then they come back and they've had a different experience. It might have been uncomfortable for them because they're trying to change a long-standing habit.
Could you give me a story of someone you recall over the past, whatever, umpteen years you've worked with?
Yeah.
Something like that was a major shift for somebody? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
No, I've got bucket loads of stories. Sometimes they all merge into the same space. Okay, so a common story that comes up. I'm often chosen in the selection process by people who are more introverted. And somehow they've associated, they declare themselves as introverted, and then as part of the story of introversion, it's like, well, I can't speak on stage, or I'm really uncomfortable, terribly uncomfortable on stage. And so we go into why, and there's usually something. They had a bad experience in the third grade, or they've been given really terrifically awful feedback from a significant, influencer in the organization, or simply the fact that every time they get to go on stage, they flush and they sweat and their heart's racing, and so they've told themselves a story that there's something legitimately to fear here, and they believe that.
Yeah.
So I invite them to consider a different interpretation. And there's lots of different stories or examples or metaphors that I will bring in. One that really resonates for a lot of people is I invite them to think about 4 or 5 Academy Award winning actors that they know and like, right? It's a different answer for everybody.
Right.
One of the psychology assessment firms did a thing a number of years ago where they went back all the way to the beginning of the Oscars to see if they could kind of use their typology to name the personality of all of these people. What was interesting about it, what I pulled out of that fun article, was that something like 80 to 85% of the best, like the top winners in almost every category, are introverts. And then when you think about what you see on ground every day, that's true. The people who are Academy Award winners are not the people in the celebrity magazines. They go home after they play the role. They go home. They don't really care to be seen, right? They deeply understand that it is a role they're playing. They play that role, but that's not who they are. They go home. They're someone else. Extroverts, on the other hand, they're always on fire. Like, it's really hard for me to play a different role. I'm a bad actor because I'm always me. And so when people consider that, it's like, okay, here's a different story. My going on stage doesn't require that I be inauthentic or that I not be me. But right now, that audience needs me to, clarify a message or hold a space or, make something safe. So I teach them how to inhabit that role, to put on that body and go out there. And when they do it enough, when they do it enough and never, they get out of their head that they have to become an extrovert. No, you just have to be able to play one in a movie every once in a while, but you can still come back to your office and close the door and lock it afterwards. You can still be an introvert.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, it's this whole issue of identity
Mm.
is a very complex thing that most people don't get into. So people think of their identity as their personality. Their
And identity is a story.
identity is a story,
Yeah.
right? So who we are essentially is not our is not our well, that might be our true identity is who we are essentially, which is simply I'm an aware being here in the present moment with a body, with a mind. I'm just here. I'm aware. And then and that's always there. It's sort of a grounding. And from there I can say, well, what's needed at this moment?
Yeah.
So, if like when I'm with my dogs, I have a particular identity or personality with my dogs, which is loving and kind and, playing with them. And it's, which is a nice thing to bring up. But, so that's great. It's like, what role do you need to play? It's a role. That's fine. I really like that. But that's not the kind of person I am. Well, but often that's just the thought of some sort of personality aspect of theirs that they have once in a while,
Yeah. And the conversation needs to happen differently in your head if you're a leader.
Yeah.
It's not about who you are. You took this role on because somebody else needs something from you. What are you the steward of? Who
Yeah.
are you responsible for? And what do they need? And I don't really give a F what you need in that circumstance. You're being paid to make tough decisions and to create a safe, a psychologically safe space for other people to bring their best self to work. And if doing some of those things you think is out of sync with who you are, then you need to learn how to wear a different story in your body to deliver what they need. It can't, like, you have to be aware of yourself, but it can't be about you. It has to be about what the people you serve need.
Right.
Learn that skill, but it doesn't have to define who you are. You can keep your identity and expand your toolkit.
Right. Right.
I say this to clients all the time. Coaching is not about changing who you are. It's about expanding who you are. So if this is your comfort zone right now,
Yeah.
great. First, let's be aware of it. And then as a coach, I'm going to take you right up to the edge of it and we're going to step over the edge. And every time you practice something new that you didn't think you could do before, guess what? Your comfort zone now expands because that is now also available to you.
Right. Yeah. I noticed in my business, well, I did a lot of things, but I had to learn a lot of technical things I had no technical background, but it's like I had to do it. So, I threw myself into it, how to learn all these computer things we have to learn these days. And I notice a lot of people are very intimidated by that stuff. Oh, I can't do that stuff. And that's sort of an identity, and holding on to that identity is very, very limiting.
That's a story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you and I are
write. Well, yeah, discover how you can write. Let's work on that. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to technology, that is a common story. You and I are of an age that we would be classified demographically as digital immigrants. Like, we did not grow up with it. We had to come into that space. Whereas I have grandchildren who've been, using a smartphone to call their grandparents since they were 4.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just crazy. Well, as a digital immigrant, I also have a choice around whether or not I'm going to come to that new country but continue to speak my old language and expect everybody else to understand me, or if I'm going to learn the new language.
Right.
Like if somebody came over to the US from Spain and said, I'm only going to speak Spanish, well, you're restricting yourself. There's only certain stores and neighborhoods you're going to be able to go to.
Yeah.
Because the dominant language here is English. But if you learn a little bit and you work with other people who know a little bit of Spanish, you'll probably be fine. So, like I walk around. One of the a thing that seems to puzzle people, especially other people my age, is how I no longer carry a wallet. I
Really?
don't carry anything on me because in my state, my digital license will suffice. I have all my credit cards on here.
Driver's license?
It's locked by my face, so I'm not revealing anything here. All my credit cards are here. All my membership cards are here. I can make a payment to somebody in India from my phone. I can make a purchase just about anywhere with my phone. I can prove who I am with my phone. I can go to the theater with my tickets on my phone.
Right.
And people go, "How do you do that?" And I'm like, "You just had to learn.
There's definitely.
You had to expand and stop telling yourself the story. Oh, I didn't grow up with it, therefore I can't do it."
Right. I want to jump to another topic it's related to the interview that I had yesterday with a guy named Chris Henderson.
Yeah.
And we want this executive presence. We want to be present. We want to be able to expand our comfort zone. We want to question our stories, all these kind of things. We're very much working on who I am and how I'm expressing in the world and interacting with my fellow workers and subordinates, boss, et cetera, so that, the world spins around me instead of me being spun around uncontrollably. But there's a bit of an issue in that a lot of companies are very dysfunctional. They don't have.
That's why I have work to do, Robert.
They don't have a purpose. They don't have a very good direction. You go into meetings and they're chaotic, and it's like, if I have executive presence and all of these things, and I develop that, of course, I can bring that into the situation to make things better. But I see that people get ground to a pulp in organizations just because of the culture has been around for a long time. This is the way we do things here.
Right.
So his work is getting the executive team together and saying, well, what do we really want, and what's really important to us, and what are our priorities, and what are our, all of that piece, so these are different domains of working with companies, but it must be awful. I've only had a couple jobs in my life. I've been self-employed basically since high school. And the couple jobs that I've had, I didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
And just the thought of working with a company that grinds you up because of its dysfunctionality is not a pleasant thought for me. So, hence we are self-employed. We have our own thing that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with that kind of thing? You're dealing with a smart person that wants to learn and be a better leader in a company that has a lot of problems.
Yeah. I mean, that could be a whole conversation, workshop, interview in itself. I mean, what I did when I was in the corporate space as an HR leader across 3 different companies, I developed with one of my CEOs a culture transformation approach that integrated a lot of different tools and philosophies, teachable point of view, appreciative inquiry, open space, creating spaces for clarity of communication and for people to be heard. Now, and I've done that for lots of my clients over time. The thing is, unless people are aware of the toxicity that they are creating and care about it, they're not going to bring in a culture consultant. They're not going to make the change. I do a lot of team coaching, like executives teams, sometimes as part of culture change, and sometimes just because they want to become a more cohesive team. And I learned a new distinction just about 2 years ago. In the coaching world, we have new competencies and distinctions around team coach, and so I was immersed in a program. It was actually a new program, so I was part of the faculty because I'm experienced, and I was also a student in the program. So I got to benefit from all and the new distinction is this. Very often what happens is a team will come together and they try and work on defining their purpose. What's our purpose as a team? What's our purpose as a department? And my entire career, that's always been the approach. Well, this new distinction is, well, instead of it's not really about the team defining their purpose. There was something that brought you together as a team. What was that? So the question shifts from what's our purpose as a team to what's the purpose that caused our team? If we can define that, that can become a driver for us. And if you can't name it, then why are you all getting together and having meetings? Like, right?
Yeah.
It's completely reversed that. And I've challenged some groups with that. Not necessarily saying they were dysfunctional, but very often when I come in to work with a team, they are challenged by something. Something's going on in the organization,
Sure.
Disruptiveness within their group. They're not being as effective as they'd like to be. And when I've thrown that reverse question at them, it causes a different kind of conversation because it refocuses everybody on why are we here as an organization? Not what are we supposed to do, but why are we here? Like if there's not a legitimate market or a customer base, and part of the reason why the leadership team is here is to serve the customer. How do we serve the customer? By building an organization that provides a service or product that they want. And how do we do that? Well, by building a team of people and engaging those people in the work. Oh, that's very different, isn't it? Because now my job as a leader is to take care of the people who are doing the work that serves the customer.
Right.
If my only purpose is to create shareholder value, I could give shit about the people on the floor. And that's what you often see. The people in charge who are not leaders, they're managers.
Yeah.
They don't care. And that's what leads to a dysfunctional organization.
I was online the other day researching a company that makes the bagel that I eat.
Okay.
It's called the Alvarado Bakery, and it's in Petaluma, California. And they make an interesting kind of bread. They sprout all the wheat first, and which makes it more digestible, etc. And they went from making a few hundred loaves a day to 40,000 loaves a day.
Wow!
But I was so impressed by the culture that they cared about the product and they cared about the people, and it was a cooperative. So everyone had ownership in the company.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's such an enlightened kind of way of looking at a company where everybody's important, everybody's input makes a difference. We care about you. You become friends with the people at work. The managers. I suppose we're talking about a utopia, but it can happen in some companies that we're passionate about the product.
Yeah.
We care about it. We want you to be with this company for a long time and grow and make good money and grow your families. And that's culture, really.
That's culture. And, and I invite you to also notice that just the words you used, that's a story. They're enlightened. What does that mean? How is it that companies that actually care about people and treat them well and have a fluid, aligned system people, product, purpose, planet, customer, all this other bit. Why is it that they are seen as unicorns? I find that a very strange story, because I promise you, there is not an MBA curriculum in the world that doesn't say to people, here's what leadership is.
Yeah.
But then what people go out and do is they listen to the financial analysts and they focus on the short-term return to shareholders. We could do another whole workshop.
Yes. This is why I'm interviewing so many people in so many different areas I'm getting so many interesting aspects of what it is that makes things work. And so, but I've really enjoyed this conversation because I haven't really, never really dived into this sort of concept of executive presence. And, it comes down to some very simple but very, very powerful things.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you have executive presence, it's not just a buzzword. It's like there's a reality there. This person does have executive presence. They listen. They're there. They care.
Right.
They're willing to learn and encompass things in a different way. They like their the people that they're working with.
So
thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today, Jim. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Robert.